Okay, well, let's get started then. It's now a couple of minutes past. Just to let you know that this is being recorded. The way that it has been set up is if you want to ask any questions, or you want to put something to either all of the panel members or one of the panel members, if you can put that in the chat, we will come to it throughout the discussion. But it's just a little bit easier to manage to have it all done in the chat rather than have microphones on and screens on and so on. So let's get started if we can. Welcome to the webinar on Agile and Inclusive Working, the new normal. As I mentioned, keep your questions coming in throughout on the chat. There may be more of me sort of discussing with the panel to start off with, but we will get to your questions at later stages. My name is Brian Meakin. I'm a journalist, event host, and also a non-executive director at Fair Play Trading, which is, for those of you who don't know, the new sort of newish commercial arm of Gwaith. We've got a great panel today of experts who we're going to be hearing from about new inclusive working practices, agile working, what employers want, what employees want. We've got Tash Davis, who is the policy and research lead at Gwaith. She oversees all the policy and research work, including the recent report, Agile and Inclusive Working, the New Normal, which we're going to be hearing a lot more about today. We've also got Shoko Docherty. She's the Chief Executive of Celtic English Academy. They are recent winners of Gwaith's Womenspire Fair Play Employer Award for their work becoming a gold standard fair play employer during the pandemic. And we've also got Steph Griffiths, who is the commercial director of Gwaith. She oversees and looks after all the commercial operations of the organisation, as well as overseeing Fair Play Employer Programme. Welcome to all three of you. And welcome to the audience as well. Let's start off, first of all, with you, Tash, because you did this report, you're responsible for this report. Why is this an issue that Gwaith has been focusing on and talking about?
Yeah, so it's a topic really that as an organisation we've been talking about in some way, shape or form. The language has shifted over time, but we've been talking about it in some way, shape or form since we were first created and set up nearly 30 years ago. And sort of most people I'm sure on the call will know who Gwaith are, but we're sort of our core focus is around tackling gender inequality in Wales, in society, in the economy. And the reality is that the way that work is structured has a massive impact on women's equality in the economy. Whether we're looking at issues like the fact that women are less likely to be in employment, are more likely to work part-time, which usually comes with lower wages, underrepresented in senior positions, underrepresented in certain sectors of the economy. Often that's linked to the fact that they take on the majority of caring responsibilities. So this issue of how flexible, agile, inclusive our workplaces are is a really important part of the solution in order to get a gender equal Wales, which we know will not only bring benefits for women, for their families, reduce risks of poverty, etc., but we know that there's huge economic potential to be unleashed there as well. Report that we did a few years ago suggested that we could add over 13 billion to Wales's economy through greater gender equality in the labour market. So while not a silver bullet, certainly there's lots of other stuff that does need to happen. This issue of how we structure work, how flexible and agile work is a really important part of our efforts. Sorry, Brian, you're on mute.
Somebody had to be, it may as well be me. So Tash, just tell us what employers have been telling you as part of this report, because of course, there has been, I think, a lot of reticence among some employers to move towards agile working. Has that changed, and has that changed permanently?
Yes, I think it has changed, and I think it has changed permanently. So when we originally planned to do this bit of work, we planned it long before COVID was a thing, but we ended up running our discussions with stakeholders in the midst of the pandemic. So, I mean, we had to change how we delivered the project. All of a sudden, our discussion groups were online as well. And I think that's really important context, because it meant that this issue was really at the forefront of people's minds. Preconceptions about what could work had already kind of been challenged. And we were getting daily lessons on what was working, but also what wasn't. And I think whether we like it or not, this shift in how we structure work is happening. I don't think it's something that we can just let run. I think it's something that we have to steer, because if we don't steer it, it's highly unlikely that it's going to be inclusive. And what we're going to see is this recreation of the inequality that we've seen over the last few decades in the labour market. In terms of sort of what we heard from employers, we had quite wide-ranging discussions, I think it's fair to say. We talked about language. So until a little while ago, you would have heard Parite talking about modern working practices, which I think we can all agree is a bit jargony. What does that actually mean? And that was a big part of our discussion with employers in particular. And we landed on this term agile and inclusive, because I think the understanding of what agile working is has come on a long way. We know that it's about more than just flexible working in terms of the right to request flexible working. It's about more than remote working. It's about genuine agility in how, where and when people are able to do the jobs that they're employed to do. And obviously the inclusive point, really important from our perspective, because as I said, unless we're focused on that, it's highly unlikely that this shift is going to be equitable. The other sort of key things that came through from the discussions with our stakeholders was that this certainly isn't about a one-size-fits-all approach. We can't just go from everybody be in the office Monday to Friday 9 to 5 to everybody sit at home Monday to Friday 9 to 5 in front of your computer or taking calls. So hybrid very much was the preferred way forward, with a mix of home-based, remote working, office-based working, in a way that allows flexibility and autonomy for employees, because we know that that's how we can get the best out of our workforce. Well-being was another really important issue that came up, and about how we safeguard well-being of our staff, of our leaders as well, in this new dispersed and hybrid way of working without that regular touch point face-to-face. How do we make sure that people are doing okay, that stress levels are healthy, are where they need to be? So there was a real sort of consensus that well-being has to be a priority for leaders in this, particularly in this new way of working, and that a really important part of doing that, keeping that focus, will be having well-being strategies in place. And then we also talked about the topic of leadership and management. What does that look like in this new world? What attributes do our leaders need? What skills do they need? Is there a need for training to get people to be there? Because it is a very different way of leading. It's a very different way of managing. New technology and tools are coming out all of the time. How can we use these to make sure that we're still effective, efficient, productive, but also healthy and well and happy in work in this new space? And what can we as leaders and managers do to deliver that? And then it's kind of the last thing that sort of came up with within the discussions, I guess, was what the role of government is. And there was real sort of clear call from employers that, certainly from the UK government, who are responsible for employment law, there might be a need to change some employment law. There are still aspects that require face-to-face checking of ID and the like. Is this really appropriate for a more digital and hybrid world? Probably not. So there's likely to be need to be some changes there, but also for government at all levels, this the role of them to be leaders in this field, walking the walk themselves, creating the environment in which we can sort of explore this new way of working. And there was a lot of support for things like the remote working hubs that Welsh Government are piloting to see how this sort of environment can be created.
Shoko, I mean, you've been going through this as an employer during the whole pandemic. How does what Tasha said chime with your experiences?
Well, there's so many things that Tasha said resonate what we have already experienced. So we strongly believe in creating an inclusive and working environment which will raise productivity and also well-being of our staff. Personally, I'm a mum of 3 young children with supportive staff, but then we don't really have any other family support near where we live. All of my family are in Japan, for example. So I knew from my own personal experience the importance of creating an agile and inclusive working environment. And during the pandemic, yes, we all had to switch from, traditional way of working in an office to everybody suddenly had to stay at home. We saw some opportunities there, and we wanted to harness the opportunity in the face of a COVID crisis, and we wanted to take the chance to make further positive and sustainable changes. But at the same time, when I was doing research about agile working or flexible working, there was so many information perhaps out there on the internet or books you can learn and understand the concept and the benefit, but how you implement it was like enigma. I've never worked in an actual flexible work environment personally, and it's all new uncertainties, and I didn't know if we introduce something, I wasn't sure if our staff would be on board. I don't know if I could really translate that concept to our staff really well. So it was great for us that we could work with Coritech. And when I was doing all research, I ended up in a Coritech's website. I worked with Coritech before a couple of years ago, and the experience of working with Coritech and look at our work environment through Agile National 2 project was great. So when I ended up on a Coritech's website, I thought, okay, I actually need professional support to implement this to be successful, because if we implement something not really well, then perhaps we end up going back to pre-COVID way of working, or perhaps create more divide. So yeah, so I totally agree with what Tasha said.
Steph, you speak to a lot of employers from all over. I mean, does that chime with what you've been hearing from them as well?
Absolutely. I mean, since the pandemic, we've witnessed an enormous shift in attitudes towards flexible and agile working. There was definitely a perception of limitations for agile work and home working and remote working pre-COVID, and many organisations had to shift overnight. Not all of them were as proactive as Shoko was in terms of looking at that environment and how to create that inclusive working environment, which it's been fantastic working with Shoko and her team to actually achieve that and look at a different way of and different model of working. There's many organisations we've worked with that, even though they were working with us looking at equality, diversity and inclusivity, were still quite resistant in terms of flexible and agile working and thinking about how things can work. And I'm talking about very traditional sectors here like manufacturing, engineering and so on, which have very dominantly been kind of on-site environments. And we have one client, manufacturing and engineering client, which completely shifted and transformed the way that they worked, literally overnight. In fact, before COVID regulations come in the UK, because they utilised the experience of one of their sister organisations in Italy who'd gone through the pandemic, started that a bit before us, and they shifted quite dramatically. And they've shifted permanently, and they've kind of reimagined what they're doing as an organisation and how they operate as an organisation. And what they did see, even in that first 6 months, was actually increased productivity of staff, which is really phenomenal if you think of the challenges that all of us were facing during that time. You know, from isolation for those of us that live alone, for, you know, hassles and difficulties with childcare for those of us with children. You know, I personally, my daughter was 8 months old when the pandemic hit. I just came back from maternity leave and she couldn't go into childcare. So for the first 5 months, I had an 8-month-old with me at home, which was really challenging. But, you know, all of us had those really massive challenges and that fear, I guess, of living in a pandemic situation, which let's face it, it seemed like a movie rather than being real life. So the fact that organisations were actually seeing increased productivity through this just gives us a glimpse of the potential that agile working can have for organisations. But very much as Shoko said, what we're talking to organisations about and what's come up with our clients time and time again, and we've had an influx of clients in coming to us in relation to this, is the way, you know, how to do that properly. How do you tackle that in the correct way? How do you tackle it in an inclusive way so that you don't face silo working, so you don't create additional barriers to people joining in and being part of the organisation, to make sure you communicate effectively with organisations and with staff internally, and so that expectations can be managed as well. A big part of the work we did with Shoko, which I'm sure she'll share as we go through, was around creating a staff charter and in moving to an agile working environment, which just manages that expectations from staff of, you know, how and when people work, how that differs, how and when to expect responses to things, and how we communicate effectively, because we have been overloaded by communication channels through the pandemic situation. You know, it's gone from your typical face-to-face meetings and occasional emails to everybody's on Teams and Zoom and a million other platforms that everybody's communicating on. So it's almost communication overload in a sense. So managing that expectation is really important, and making sure we're looking at
not just what the flexible or agile working policy might be in the organisation, but also looking at what the performance management structure is. You know, what do our job descriptions, do they relate anymore to the work that we're doing and the way that we do it? And how are our communication strategies impacting that? That's an enormous piece of work to get right. So it's fab that so many organisations have taken that approach to get that expert guidance, and that's part of what we're doing through Fair Play Employer at the moment, is providing that guidance and that critical friend to support along that journey, because it is a journey to get there. But yeah, absolutely, it's completely resonating with the clients we're seeing at the moment, Brian.
And Steph, I think that is quite an important point, isn't it? Because a lot of people, when they hear about concerns over agile working and flexible working, is that it's quite easy potentially to implement it in some work environments and some office spaces. It's much more difficult in, say, some manufacturing-based workplaces. I mean, how do you make sure going ahead that inclusiveness, you know, agile working is fair and available for lots of different people?
That's a fantastic question, Brian, and it's one of the most common questions we get, particularly from those industries, you know, like manufacturing, like construction, that really struggle with this. There's innovative ways and concepts that we can work and tackle any environment, and we have to take everyone on a case-by-case basis. So there's never a one-size-fits-all approach to agile working. And even within an organisation, let's take Gwaith as a great example of that. You know, even in an organisation like ours, that's, you know, we've got some client-facing activities. We're quite office-based in the sense of what we do, or classroom-based in some of the training we deliver. But all of our staff as individuals, what works for one person in terms of agile working doesn't work for another. So we have to adapt that approach quite flexibly to make sure we are being inclusive, which is why hybrid environments, I think, are being talked about more and more frequently. So having that ability to meet up in a face-to-face context, obviously when it's safe to do so and in a safe environment, but also, you know, balancing that out with what other staff may need. So some staff may be way too far to actually do face-to-face meetings. So how do you make sure that you're being inclusive across the board? So inclusive policies and practices. And that's why in any change like this with agile working, you have to take an inclusive first approach with it to make sure that you are accounting for every individual in the organisation. And it's, you know, even in one set team, there's individuals in that team that things will work differently for, that you need to accommodate. So it's very much that step-by-step guidance and looking at each organisation as an individual, what options there are, and giving staff the autonomy to be quite flexible as well in how they want to work, because that's incredibly empowering for staff members, and that really increases that efficiency and productivity within organisations. And so many of our clients are reporting a significant increase in ROI actually from embedding these policies and practices in place, because, you know, Tash talked very much in the beginning about well-being and mental health, and the importance of looking at well-being. That's essential for any working environment. The troubles you can get in with an agile working environment is if it's not introduced properly with good boundaries and measures in place, you can risk burnout of staff, because staff can think, well, I need to be available all the time, rather than just, no, actually, I can manage my own diary and I don't need to be responsive to every single email or whatever hour of the day it comes in. So in managing those expectations is really critical. So it is very much a case-by-case basis.
Tash, just before I come to you, it's just a reminder to the audience members and those listening in that you can put your questions in the chat, and we will get to those questions as well. Otherwise, you'll just hear more from me. So just be warned. Tash, just to explain to us, I mean, one of the crucial topics, and Steph sort of touched on it, and Shoko touched on it as well, is about leadership and management and how their roles change during the pandemic and with agile and inclusive working. What sort of things have to be done in order to support managers, support leaders as they go through this huge change management process?
Yeah, no, it is huge, and I think there's sort of a couple of important sort of things to look at, and certainly I think there's certainly going to be a need to redefine what leadership and management looks like, what good leadership management looks like, and the attributes that a good and effective leader and manager has in this new way of working. And that's certainly sort of where we got to with our discussions with our stakeholders for the report. They talked about the need for effective communicators, leaders who are able to engage in active listening, who have regular contact and use different communication channels depending on what works best for a particular aspect of work or for a particular member of the team. The issue of empathy came up as well, about understanding about what agile and inclusive looks like for different members of our team and being responsive to those different experiences and those different needs. The need for leaders and managers to be good role models came through really strongly, picking up really what Steph was saying there about the risk of burnout. We do not do our teams any favours if we are responding to emails till late in the evening. We're always online, because you can say everything you like as a leader, like, no, we don't expect you to work that way. But if you're working that way, the expectation is implied. And you know, we've all felt that pressure from people, our own managers and leaders who do that. So that role modelling of sort of what that should look like and a healthy work-life balance, I think, is really, really important. There was also talk about sort of, I suppose, what are generally called softer skills, but I hate that term because I think they're so important, about leaders and managers who are emotionally intelligent, who are open and transparent, because the agile working, agile and inclusive working hinges on a very different relationship between employer and employee than perhaps we saw in traditional ways of working in the past. It has to be based on mutual respect, trust. Otherwise, you can't get that autonomy piece, and you do risk falling into a space of micromanagement then, which is no good for anybody. And another thing that sort of came through was about visibility, about leaders being visible across an organisation, which, you know, if you're used to having all of your staff in one big office, it's very easy. People see you. Might see you in the corner office if you still have offices, but, you know, people see you. In this world, you could go weeks without seeing a member of your leadership team, and that won't be a deliberate thing, but that can just fuel that isolation and disconnect, and then we potentially risk losing that sense of belonging that people should have with the organisation that they work for. So those are the kind of leaders and managers that the people we spoke to thought we need to have, and I think that does give rise to a number of sort of training needs and how we're sort of upskilling our current leaders and managers, but also how we're preparing people who are on that management pathway. There needs to be some training around how to effectively manage a dispersed team. The considerations that you need to make if you're going to run hybrid meetings, because that's going to be the future, where there will be some of us together in person and some people dialing in. The way you run those meetings needs to be very different if people are going to play an active role. I think there's a point around self-awareness, particularly if as leaders we're going to be good at that role modelling piece. We need to be being self-aware about how we're being in work. I think there's some training that's needed around how leadership styles fit in this new world. We've probably all done leadership training where we talk about the different styles of leadership. Well, they're going to have different pros and cons in this new environment, and we need to be supported to understand those. There's stuff around sort of motivating dispersed teams. I think there's training around well-being and communication in this space, those softer skills. And we did hear from our stakeholders about resilience. Now, I've got to be honest, personally, I hate the R word. Because I think it's come to have quite negative connotation, but we know what sits behind that. It's around looking after ourselves. It's essentially about self-care, and I think it's not just leaders and managers, but all of us, particularly given the 18 months we've had with the world essentially being on fire, literally in some parts of the world, God, you know, like there's just so much stress and anxiety around us. We've got the pressures of work and a drastically different work environment to deal with as well. The issue of self-care, I think, needs to be central to so many of us, whether we're in those leadership and management roles or not.
Shuka, as someone who's sort of gone through this and adapted her business during this pandemic, what sort of changes do you think there are that are needed in terms of the skills and experience that managers and leaders have in order to, you know, make sure things do stay agile and inclusive moving forward?
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of things already mentioned by Steph and Tasha, but basically when I understood the benefit of the agile working environment concept, I couldn't envisage what it would look like in my own organization. We have some customer facing staff, or back office staff, teaching staff, just different type of role. So firstly, to look at job descriptions and really understand the need, but also even before looking at job description, actually what we did is to talk to our staff. Like Steph said, you know, agile working has to fit in a different sort of personal circumstances. So really understand what our staff's needs are, and then just, you know, creating the sessions to sort of making the rules we call service level agreement, but basically the promises between our staff how to communicate on certain things, or how frequently we have a meeting, or the deadline of, you know, when do we reply emails. We basically went through all those rules so that we have accountabilities and boundaries. So that's really important. But from leader point of view, when we were implementing everything, plus going through whole COVID, I had to protect our business, I had to protect our staff, and also implementing this new agile working environment. I just felt that, you know, I care everything, but I also gave quite a lot, give. And also I felt that I have to step up quite a lot as well at the same time. And when we did Qualitech survey, there was one of the questions said, can you be yourself in your organization? And I think that's really important. So we have to make sure that our staff feel that they can be themselves, they can share how they feel, but at the same time, leaders should be able to express their needs and, you know, be equal to our staff. And that's something I learned through the trainings and the work that we did with Qualitech.
Steph, what's your thoughts on, you know, what managers and leaders need, and particularly, I guess, if you're looking at, you know, if you're working in an environment where people, you can spot whether somebody is struggling, you can spot whether their workload is too much. It's much harder to do that if you're not seeing them as regular, isn't it? So how do you overcome that?
It is. It's incredibly challenging to work in this new world. Is really challenging, and many of us were forced into this with kind of no notice and no training. So making sure that staff are trained now is really an essential part to create that really inclusive working environment and culture. And the other thing for organisations to really bear in mind is they are leaders quite often who drive the culture within the organisation. It's more the kind of the middle tier and lower management that actually drive and enforce that culture within an organisation and enforce the values. So it's so important for those leaders to be equipped with the skills and confidence to be able to lead efficiently. And through the work that we did around producing this report, actually, the research that Tasha's team did, following that and following another several focus groups, we've actually developed our inclusive leadership programme through Fair Play Employer that we've launched quite recently. We're running the pilot at the moment, and the first official programme starts in January. So there's a couple of spaces left if anybody wants to get involved. But, you know, part of that programme was really looking at a really robust programme to equip leaders with the skills they need, and to create that truly inclusive work environment. You know, Tasha's mentioned quite a bit of this already, and Shoko's covered it as well, but they really need to embody that inclusive approach, and they need to fully understand what it means to be an inclusive leader and to be an authentic leader as well. And Shoko, you know, your point there about bringing yourself to work is so crucial in that aspect. But more than that, leaders also need to understand what legislation is in place and how that supports their decision making. You know, a lot of us rely quite heavily on our people or our HR teams within organisations. And for many of us who work in SMEs, which is the majority of the population in Wales, that team might be one person, you know, so their ability to support everyone in that sense is really, really limited. So if leaders can understand what legislation is in place and what systems are in place to support their decision making, that also helps. But they need that really good level of emotional intelligence to deal with their team as individuals. And Tasha talked a lot about this in relation to empathy. They need to really understand that to be able to deal with everyone as an individual, and to be able then to adjust and flex their personal leadership style to adapt that to the situation or the individual. They need to be able to understand, and Tash covered this, how to manage, you know, a distributed workforce, manage hybrid teams, manage those meetings effectively, and how to, more importantly, perhaps lead those conversations on mental health and well-being, because that's one of the most incredibly difficult challenges as a leader, is managing those conversations. And I think it was Tash that mentioned you have to be protecting your own mental health and well-being as well at the same time, and exhibiting that and being a good role model for staff. So giving leaders the skills and understanding, you know, what that means for you as a leader, and then how you support your team in that, and how you lead and you know, direct those conversations, because it is challenging. Cultivating that coaching culture on the team as well, and supporting everybody within it to thrive, and having a really good understanding of, you know, unconscious biases or biases and microaggressions that fall into the workplace. Having that understanding and being a better ally to colleagues that might need that additional support is really fundamental to be an inclusive leader as well. But most importantly for us, and the main aim of the Inclusive Leadership Programme, is to have that confidence to challenge. And whether that's challenging working practices internally with your organisation, or whether that's challenging your colleagues or the wider society, it's just having that confidence and that belief in yourself, and, you know, having that backing and understanding of what inclusive working does look like and what inclusive leadership looks like, to keep challenging the status quo. You know, that challenge is ever evolving. We know we've seen that through COVID, we've seen that through the Black Lives Matter movement that's happened in the last 18 months as well. You know, we're seeing that continuously more and more. And there was a report published, or an article published, showing research that Robert Half have done this morning in relation to how important diversity and inclusion is in the workplace. And organisations that don't actually look at that are going to be at risk of falling behind and not being able to get the correct talent. And the job market is absolutely crazy at the moment. It's levelling with the housing market, I think. It's absolutely mad. And to recruit and retain that better, retain is probably the biggest aspect. To retain that level of talent within your organisation, you have to have that inclusive culture. So providing that leadership management training to your leaders, that they are your biggest asset, because they are driving that culture within your organisation. So it's absolutely essential. So to any organisations that haven't done this, you know, get on the ball and get rolling with it, because it's so fundamental to create that good inclusive culture, but also a profitable and efficient organisation as well, and allow you to progress and attract that and retain that better talent.
Yeah, I think it's that thing that they always say, you know, what happens if we train these people and they leave? And then you say, what happens if we don't train them and they stay?
Yeah.
So Tash, just from your point of view, I mean, how important do you think it is ultimately to have equality at the kind of driving force of this as being central to this new way of working?
I think it's critical. I mean, obviously I would say that, but it is critical, because it has to be the golden thread that comes through everything, every part of the process that you might go on, from the moment that you're even thinking about it, when you're starting to engage staff. It has to be there, because time and again we have seen that change won't automatically result in greater equity and a more equal space. It won't. This idea that stuff just trickles down has been disproved so many times, and it's only by having that sort of really central focus on equity, on inclusion, that we are going to see the shift, which, as I said earlier, is happening whether we like it or not, that we see the shift actually tackle some of those long-standing inequalities in the labour market. You know, and there are lots of lessons that we can learn from what's gone on in the last 18 months. The shift to home working during the pandemic, for some people, fantastic. It worked really, really well. They've got a nice space at home. They're now better able to balance work and care. For other people, it didn't really work at all, because they haven't got the luxury of space at home, or their home isn't a safe environment, or they're isolated because they live alone. So there are lessons from that sort of necessarily rapid shift that we can learn, where there perhaps it wasn't felt that there was time to focus on equality, where unintended consequences have been seen as a result. And I think I suppose to link that back to kind of what Steph was saying, is that an important part of this will be sort of how we structure work, how we organise work, the policies and procedures that we have in place. But ultimately, culture is key. And fostering, developing or changing culture in this dispersed way is going to be much more difficult. You can't just rely on something kind of working in an office. If people have got views that perhaps might be challenged if they're talking in the office, that might not happen when they're working in a dispersed way. You might have teams developing their own little microcultures, and they're not aware that that's out of step with the rest of the organisation. So leadership on that is absolutely critical. But there's also a need to bring everybody in the organisation on this journey with us. And again, equity and inclusion are critical to that, because we have to bring everybody in the organisation and make sure that the space that we're creating, the culture that we have, is one in which everybody can thrive. Otherwise, I mean, yeah, we're just going to be stuck with the same old status quo, which quite simply has never been good enough.
Shuko, how central do you think equality is as you move forward with your business and with your plans for inclusive and agile workplace?
I think that's just absolutely important part of inclusive and agile work environment and organisation. Ultimately, it creates better morale, attract more skills and experienced staff. But like Steph said, actually retain skilled and experienced staff. All of us go through different life stages. Perhaps have a children, or perhaps have caring responsibilities over their elderlies, or perhaps the wider communities. If they started working with us 5 years ago, perhaps their life stage is completely different now. And to be able to offer flexible and adaptable work environment, it's so vital to retain those staff so that we can grow together as well. And offering work-life balance, create positive culture, but ultimately when the staff are motivated and feel that they can still perform in different circumstances, then that will increase productivity. So yeah, so equality is vital.
And Steph, I'm going to ask you the same question, and then we have a question from one of the audience, so we'll go to Lee after that, but I'll let you answer that one first, Steph, about the importance of equality going forward.
Yeah, I think it's paramount. I mean, we've talked about this throughout the panel discussion already, and I mentioned, about talent acquisition earlier as well. It's so fundamental for organisations to have an equality first approach to everything that they do now. People are asking for more and they're demanding more. Our employees and our staff want better from us. They want better working environments. They want more agile working environments. They want to be able to work in an environment that's much more friendly and works around their lifestyle, not just, the 9 to 5, the average work. And I think the importance of agile working as well, and I can just see something's popped up in the chat, I haven't read it through yet, but the importance of agile working as well allows those that maybe haven't been able to come into employment in the normal 9 to 5 working environment a bit more agility to be able to actually come back into the working environment. We're working through Fair Play Employer at the moment with Carers Wales, and we're looking at those carers that have been removed from the working environment because of their care and responsibilities and how they can come back. And very often the conversations that we talk about is that a kind of standard part-time role doesn't really work for them, but an agile role in which they can actually adjust and flex and deliver, however many days worth of work it is over the week that they're doing, but flex and change that and adjust that to suit them and their working environment is more sustainable for them. So it's actually encouraging more people outside of work to get back in, and that's what that equality-driven approach will lead to. It's thinking about everybody, as far away from the labour market as they are, or whether they're in employment already, to have that option. And that's the importance of an equality-driven approach, is that it is inclusive. You are thinking of every individual. You are thinking of those removed from the labour market, those at disadvantages, whether that's women or whether we're looking at the intersectional approach to that. If you're a woman and you're a woman of colour or a woman with disability, you're even more further disadvantaged. So it's making sure that equality approach is being inclusive of everyone. And there's going to be pockets of those people who aren't in employment at the moment, or maybe are not working to their full potential because they just aren't able to access an environment where they can utilise their full skills. And we are missing as employers that talent. So it's really, really vital to look at it from that perspective as well.
Thanks, Steph. Okay, I'm going to take we've got a couple of questions now, so I'll take them in the order that they came in. The first one is from Lee, who says, as we have experienced over the last 18 months, people's financial well-being has been just as important as physical and mental well-being. It's hard to have one without the others. When you have a reference well-being, is financial well-being something you have considered, Tash? Oh, you're on mute.
I did it that time. And my chair keeps sinking. I'm so sorry. Like, and I'm just like, I'm getting lower and lower in my little box. Yes, I think it is absolutely key. And I think, again, it's part of this inclusive approach, because a move to remote working, home working, for some people will result in potentially financial savings because they're not doing the commute. For others, it leads to an increase in their outgoings because they're now putting the heating on all day, they have to upgrade their broadband. And I think this has to be a really important part of the discussion, of the planning, of the thinking, of the equality impact assessment that should be done before an employer makes these changes, and thinking about how that might need to change the benefits package that you offer as an organisation. Do we perhaps, do we need to now be thinking about a working from home allowance? Do we need to be thinking about what equipment we provide? Do we need to be thinking about budget to allow people to co-work somewhere? I think, it has to be a key part of that thinking, and it has to be there from the beginning, and it has to be informed by that focus on equality and inclusion. And as I said, through an equality impact assessment, are people going to be worse off as a result of the changes that we might want to make as an employer? If they are, what can we do to mitigate that? Because we shouldn't be leaving anybody worse off as a result of a massive shift in how we work.
Sugar, what are your thoughts on that financial well-being? Also, given that we've heard some companies sort of flag up the idea of actually paying people less if they're working from home potentially.
Wow. Okay. To be honest, our business has been severely impacted by COVID pandemic because almost everything what we do rely on international visitors and students coming to Wales and study at our academy in Cardiff. So we were aware of our company's own financial difficulties, but when we were working to implement Agile work environment as a part of wellbeing training and the staff survey, we did make sure to include financial wellbeing questions and listen to our staff of their needs. As well as I tried my very best to transparent of where our company's financial situation is. And the plan of how to recover, what's the plan for us to recover, and what's the sort of benchmark point, or so it's not quick fix because we are still in the middle of a pandemic, but at least to give them the certain uncertainties so that they can see that we are working toward a recovery, and ultimately by us looking after staff well-being and offering inclusive working environment, we want to recover, thrive, and grow together, not just for perhaps shareholders profit. It's not that we're doing that for our staff as well as for our customers. So trying to be inclusive in that context as well. That's how we try to overcome the financial well-being challenge.
Steph, I mean, I guess if companies are not thinking about financial well-being at the same time as you perhaps have more women who are working in an agile and inclusive way, you're actually compounding the inequality problem potentially, aren't you?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think it's essential that organisations are taking a financial wellbeing approach as well. And Tasha's highlighted some of the key things that organisations need to consider. And certainly an equality impact assessment would support making sure that they are thinking about all of these measures before rolling out an agile working environment or before thinking about that environment. Because Lee's absolutely right. Financial well-being is something that causes a great deal of stress and anxiety for many people. So it's so paramount to somebody's performance within an organisation and well-being within the organisation to make sure that they feel secure. And I think Shoko covered it very clearly there as well. In terms of transparency from the organisation, that's vital. Tash mentioned earlier the importance of working in this way. It creates a completely different culture of trust and respect. And I think that transparency, particularly around finances within the organisation, is really critical as well. So being very upfront about the support you can offer, but also being very honest as well, where a business might not be in a position to offer absolutely everything to everyone. We would, I think, as speaking from a senior leader position, most senior leaders would want to offer everything above and beyond to their employees, but sometimes there are limitations in place where you can't. But being transparent and communicating that effectively is so critical for staff to get that understanding and that message that everything that we can do is being done. But it's also very important to look at individuals within the organisation and to look at how important those aspects might be. So those considerations in the equality impact assessment around, is there a working from home allowance? Is there a co-working budget so that staff can get together and collaborate? What measures are we taking? What technology are we putting in place to make sure staff can do that effectively? That will support that and make sure that divide isn't exacerbated more than it already is.
Thank you. And we've only got about 10 more minutes or so. So if you do want to get questions in, get them in as soon as you can. Otherwise, we won't be able to get to you. But we do have a question from Francis, who says, the discussion so far is heavily based on those people in employment. How do you support those desperate to get back into the workplace, particularly those 55 plus? How do you encourage employers to look at the post-55 workforce as a strong and viable option? Tash?
Yeah, so I think this is a really important point, and actually it's a topic that I'm keen for us as an organisation, the older sort of female workforce, to look into in a bit more detail, because we know that age group do face particular barriers. They're often sandwich carers, potentially caring for kids, grandkids, elderly parents. There are health considerations. Menopause is an issue that is just not talked about enough. In theory, a really good, agile and inclusive way of working should be a way of opening up employment to groups for whom that sort of rigid, flexible way of working, rigid, inflexible way of working we've had doesn't work. But I think we also need to think about how daunting it could be to come back into work in this completely new environment where we're online, and we know that digital skills are more patchy amongst old generation, understandably so. And we know that the job market is ridiculously competitive at the moment, and there is an issue with employer attitude as well. So I think there's a few things that can be done. I think that there's some work to be done around sort of just employers sort of changing that perception about who a good employee looks like, or who the best employee might look like. And I think sort of applying a real sort of equalities lens to your recruitment practices is a good way of doing that. But I do think there is this bigger question about, right, if this new way of working is going to work, what support needs to be available for people who aren't used to working in this way, who aren't currently in the labour market, who haven't got the experience of the last 18 months to draw upon, perhaps. And I think there's going to be a need for training around digital skills, absolutely. I think there's going to have to be questions about making sure that hybrid working is preferred, that there are places for people to go to if home isn't an appropriate work environment. And I think for businesses that are looking to make a shift, engagement with current staff obviously is massively important to inform that decision making, to inform that equality impact assessment piece. But if you have got a group that are underrepresented in your workforce, say perhaps older women or women of colour or disabled women, I think you need to reach out beyond your current workforce, either to sort of specialist organisations who can give some insight into how the workplace can be opened up to those groups. There's tons of research out there from us, but from many other organisations that give you insight into what the barriers are and that make recommendations for change that mean you can open up that space. Because I think there is a tendency sometimes to think about diversifying the workforce, and yet we don't look outside of where we are. And it's like, well, then you're not going to get the insight or the challenge that you need to really start thinking differently about how you're designing your workplace, how you're organising work, how you're writing your job descriptions, etc. So I hope that goes some way to answering Francis's question.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. Shoko, what are your thoughts in terms of trying to reach out and, help those people perhaps over 55s back into workplaces, and what kind of support they can get from, for example, you as an employer?
Yeah, so like Tasha said, by implementing agile work environment should naturally give better perspective of offering jobs to people of different background, or perhaps different age group, LGBT community, somebody who has a chronic illness or disabilities. But we also offered training to our staff with core writing on how to remove unconscious bias to our staff, and I think that's really important. And I keep continuously to remind our staff as well on these particular topics. I'm from ethnic minority background, mid-30, but in a senior management role. So for me, from my personal experience, using my job title and meet somebody, or off street meet somebody, I don't get any direct discriminations. I never experienced that, but I do get unconscious bias disadvantage, and that's something I experience on a daily basis. So it's really important to keep reminding staff. But when we have staff from all different age background, and we offer specific trainings. We have a very comprehensive induction training and onboarding training, so that will help us to give better opportunity for every staff who start, but also give us a chance to identify their needs. So if somebody never used perhaps Slack, that's an internal communication platform that we use, we give that specific training. Or if somebody doesn't know how to use Zoom, again, just identifying and tailor the training program to those who are coming back to workplace.
Okay, we do have another question that has come from Letitia Paul. Any suggestion for housing sector on introducing agile working when we're dealing with colleagues who are on roles like repair staff and hostel staff who are required to work a certain set hours and can't work from home? I won't ask all of you this one because I want to squeeze in another question as well. But I mean, Tash, would you want to sort of come in on this one, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have like an exhaustive list necessarily of the specifics, but I think for me, yes, there is a particular challenge with non-office based roles. We know that it is much more complicated, but I think for me, it's about, and this is not the easiest thing to do, but it is essentially going back to a bit of a blank sheet of paper about how we design work, because yes, there's set hours. Yes, it's sort of external facing and office based, but there are ways that things could be done differently there. Do we chop up the jobs differently? Do we do more job shares? Do we look at are those the right set hours? There are sort of questions where I think we tend to sort of get into the space where it's like, this is what flexible working looks like, and what we need to get back to is like, right, work can look like anything. How could we design this in a way that works best? And it is engagement, and it is getting feedback, and it is sharing best practice across sectors, because we know that what works in one sector might look very different in another sector. And I think that's why it's kind of it's not a one size fits all kind of situation. It is a sort of, right, what's our specific environment? What job roles are we looking at? What questions can we ask of ourselves to completely sort of throw this up in the air and think differently about it? And that's not an easy process to do. I'm certainly not suggesting that, but I think that's the place to go, really. Just sort of try and get rid of all preconceptions about how work can be designed, and speak to the people that are doing the jobs. How do they think they could do it differently?
Yeah, if you don't mind, Brian, I just want to add in there, through Fair Play Employer at the moment, we're working with the Housing Association tackling this exact challenge. Actually, the whole Housing Association we're working with, I've worked in a very traditional way for many years, and we're working with them on actively changing the way that they're working. And it's a very big process. You know, we're spanning this piece of work over 2 years, and, you know, even then there's going to be more to do at the end of it, because shifting from a very traditional mindset and way of working is a big change and a big culture shift. And we've looked very much at this kind of repairs staff and hostel staff, and I know how that works. And we've very much done what Tash suggested in terms of going back to the drawing board. You know, what are the roles, what's needed, and picking, you know, things from other industries. Retail sector, for example, for years have done a shift share kind of basis. So they have a team of staff and they are on a shift share rota, and they work out among themselves what hours and what days they work and what suits them. You know, somebody might prefer to work later evenings because that suits them and their home situation. Somebody else might prefer mornings and being home for the school run. So they shift share around that. So it's a different way of thinking about it and going back to the drawing board. And there's also other things that you can put in place, things like hourly annual leave instead of full day annual leave. So if those members of staff just need to take a couple of hours for, you know, what comes up quite often, things like parents' evenings and things like that, where you just need it, or a doctor's appointment or whatever, you just need 2 hours out of work rather than a half a day or a full day. It gives that flexibility and that autonomy over their own work and managing their schedules in that way as well. So it gives them that opportunity to pick their hours a bit more selectively in what they do. And that's the kind of thing we're looking at with that organisation, which, you know, it is going back to the drawing board, and it is thinking about each individual as its own. But there's a couple of ideas we're working on at the moment.
So our 5-minute warning has just flashed up. We're about to come to an end of this, but I do want to squeeze in just one question, but I'm not going to ask you all, just to keep your answers to 1 minute. What actions do we think employers and business leaders should be taking to make the most of this change in how we work? Steph.
Okay, right, I'm timing myself. I think businesses need to really embrace this change. I think they need to take on board the lessons learned from the pandemic, but take the good with the bad. I think they need to be really conscious and mindful that the working from home we've experienced during the pandemic is not working from home. It's not agile working in its truest form. So we need to take, you know, some of those bad experiences out, but also learn from those experiences. What worked really well, what didn't work well, and what can we put in place. And more importantly, get someone to help you put those measures in place. Get someone to actually help and support your organisation through that journey is really crucial, because you get a wider range of perspective of what you can change as outside of your team, outside of your scope and delivery. You know, Tash mentioned earlier the difficulty with just focusing on one thing, and train your leaders. Is absolutely essential to moving forward. Make sure your leaders are equipped with the skills that they need and tools that they need to progress in this working way.
Shoko, what do you think needs to be done by business leaders to make the most of this change?
Yeah, so like I said earlier, listen to your staff and have an honest conversation about needs. And when you're trying to implement this agile work environment, involve all staff, if you're a small organization, or at least representative of all departments or all levels of your colleagues, if you're a large organization, for all process, so that everybody's on board, instead of, you know, perhaps HR department or senior management team just decide what do we want to do and assume what is the need of our organization. So getting everybody on board, and like Steph said, get expert support. It might be, you might think that it's expensive, but it's a great investment, and that will last for, you know, sustainable future of your business.
I'm very impressed with your 1 minute here. It's really sort of keeping it on the ball. Tash, it falls to you now to finish this with the 1 minute as well.
I'll try and be super concise. So my one thing would be use the tools and approaches that are out there to properly mainstream equality and inclusion into each stage of this journey as you go on it. Make sure you're measuring what you do, you're reflecting and evaluating how well things have worked, you learn and you adapt so that you can make sure that you have the most agile and inclusive space possible for as diverse an employee group as you can.
Absolutely perfect. That is quite incredible. Well done, and well done, especially for finishing up on time, which is always a bonus. Everyone is trying to squeeze in as much as we possibly can these days, aren't we? So sort of getting it finished on time really does benefit everyone, I think. Also, I'm sure that Steph and Tash will be more than pleased to hear from you if you want any help or support in your workplaces. Lots of thank yous coming through from the audience. Thank you to the audience that are taking part. I know there's a lot of time pressures with us at the moment, so it's good for you to be involved. And thank you to the panel, Tash, Shoko and Steph. Thank you very much.
Thanks, and thanks to Brian as well for chairing the panel. It's absolutely fantastic. It's been a really enjoyable session.
No worries. Yep. See you soon.
Brilliant. Thank you. Bye. Bye.